мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
We are under attack. It is an attack against Western democracies and on the institutions that bind them.
What Russia's much more interested in doing is depicting the West as a failure.
The regime and President Yanukovych, they were trying to protect their enormous wealth.
This is Kremlin File.
Welcome, everyone, to Kremlin File. We are joined in this episode by Natia Seskuria. Hi, Natia. How are you?
Hello, I'm well. How are you?
Very well, and welcome, welcome. Olga, we're very happy today.
Yes, we're so happy to have Natia here with us. I mean, this is going to be an extremely important episode, not just for U.S. listeners, but for European listeners. So I'm very happy that you are joining us. Thank you so much for
Giving
coming
us
on
your
today.
time. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much for having me. And I have to say that this is one of my favorite podcasts. So I'm very excited to be joined, to join you.
Well, we wanted to have you on for quite a while. So I think we should jump in, to the conversation. And let's start with Georgia. Okay, Natia. In 2008, as we all know, Russia attacked and illegally annexed territory in Georgia, while unfortunately and sadly, the international community just stood by, silent and watched. Putting aside, let's say, the military action and the war in Chechnya, which came before, this was the first invasion by Russia using asymmetrical warfare tactics, including the use of information warfare and military, among other things. I'm also thinking about cyber attacks, as well. So first of all, first question I wanted to ask you was, do you think that things really could have been different today from what we're seeing had the international community acted and provided aid to Georgia? What is your opinion about that? And then, can you also discuss with us a little bit about the tactics that Russia employed during the 2008 invasion in Georgia?
Of course. Thank you very much for this question. I think that's a very important question, and it's something that we can write a book about, really, because it's such a complex and such a complex and very interesting question as well from the strategy point of view, because some of the tools and mechanisms that Russia used against Georgia in 2008, I think at the time were very new. And since then, we have been seeing how Russia has really worked hard on making these tools more sophisticated to use against Ukraine and against other countries as well, because we have seen how Russia has been using its active measures against the US, against the European countries. But I think the Georgian experience is an interesting one, because first of all, we often forget what happened in 2008. And I do believe, Monique, what you mentioned, that the consequences, should the West dealt with the with the 2008 war differently, the consequences of it would have been possibly different. And I draw some similarities when it comes to what Ukraine has experienced afterwards in 2014, firstly, and then in 2022. As you mentioned, the 2008 war, the August War, as we call it, was a full-scale military confrontation invasion. And this was the first case when Russia invaded a sovereign country. And despite the fact that this was a very short war, it only lasted for 5 days, I always say that the war is not over. And Georgia is still fighting a war, despite the fact that there might be no active shooting on the ground, but there are many other ways in which Russia is still waging this war as we speak today. And I would highlight a few things. Firstly, I think the reasoning, the explanation that Russia provided is very similar. I had a déjà vu when I was listening, when I read and then listened to the justification why they were moving ahead with the so-called military special military operation in Ukraine. They mentioned NATO expansion, and the 2008 war was also directly connected to the Bucharest summit in 2008, when Georgia and Ukraine had hopes and were promised, had hopes firstly to get closer to the NATO membership by receiving a membership action plan. This obviously has not happened, but in 2008, NATO declared for the first time ever that these two countries would eventually become members of the alliance. Russia reacted quite straight away, and we have heard Lavrov and other officials claiming that this was a direct confrontation. This would have been direct confrontation with Russia because they were seeing they were looking at it as a potential threat, potential expansion of NATO alongside Russian borders. We have heard these sentences so many times since then, but I mean, ironically, I don't really think that Georgia's or Ukraine's membership into NATO was taken that seriously, or even NATO expansion. But what we see nowadays, it was actually Putin that prompted NATO to enlarge by Sweden and Finland willingly joining the alliance. And these countries have never considered before. They were happy with the status that they had before. And this was a direct reaction to the threat that was caused by Putin's imperial ambitions. And to go back to the 2008 invasion, so this came as a very surprising development. I was in Georgia back then. I remember how it started. It almost felt like a dream, really, because it started, and before we realized it was over, without knowing what future hold, really, because this was something absolutely, this was incredible. Firstly, because there was no sense that we were anywhere close to such an escalation, even though when I look back now, there were some signs that were clearly indicating that Russia was preparing for something bigger. Other than its usual use of active measures to put pressure on Georgia, such as the Kavkaz exercise, for example, the drills that happened a few weeks before this is a very common scenario, as you know, in case of Ukraine as well, that happened a few days before the beginning of the escalation, and Russians were claiming that they withdrew the forces and this was just a regular exercise. But then what happened was quite different. That they actually deployed the forces into the close proximity to the actual conflict area. So then these forces went ahead and engaged in a military escalation, and all these rhetorics that we heard in case of Ukraine, for example, the alleged genocide, the fact that Ukraine have been violating the rights of the Russian passport holders and so on. This was very common. I almost, when I was reading the Russian newspapers and Russian media reporting in 2022, it almost felt like if you would remove the name Ukraine and put Georgia, it was a similar sort of rhetoric that we've heard. But unfortunately, or in case of Ukraine, fortunately, but unfortunately for Georgia, back then in the West, there was no realization, no sense that this was something bigger. This war was seen as a local conflict, and The West I can't just say that the West did nothing. They did at least what they did was that they stopped Putin from larger escalation, and this was very important. Obviously, a number of heads of states visited Georgia, the Tbilisi, the capital, during the 5-day war, especially from Poland, Baltic states, and they stood with the Georgian people in front of the parliament, and they requested from Putin to withdraw its forces and design and stop fighting. And of course, the French president Nicolas Sarkozy back then was directly involved, and he eventually brokered a 6-point ceasefire agreement. Well, another issue is whether or not what were the consequences of this imperfect six-point ceasefire agreement. Well, we know that Putin never really fulfills the obligations that he takes. This could be international obligations or any sort of agreements that he signs up to. And this example was not an exception, and he almost immediately started violating this 6-point ceasefire agreement, and he still up to date violates it every single day, basically. But in terms of wider consequences, I think the West was very passive. There were no sanctions, there were no consequences for Russia, and even worse, soon after the war, we saw that there were further attempts from the US's side to normalize relationships with the so-called reset, and which I think, if we even put aside the Georgian example, in general, it was one of the worst foreign policy mistakes from the US's side to believe that it was ever possible to normalize these relationships under Putin and to try and play this diplomacy games with him. In terms of tools, what kind of tools were used against Georgia? This is a very interesting example because, as you mentioned, this was the first time when cyber warfare was integrated into the conventional warfare, and of course, Georgia was largely unprepared for such an offensive, and this was in general a very new tool. And I think what Ukrainians did quite well was to learn a lot of lessons out of this Georgian experience, and I think they were quite successful when it comes to cyber domain to avoid some of the damage that Russian cyber warfare could inflict on them. But in case of Georgia, that was also a novelty in a sense. And of course, the use of disinformation, the use of these narratives that were quite effective, I would say, when it comes to the Western audience, unfortunately. Maybe at the time, Georgia was not doing that well in terms of strategic communications either, and in terms of confronting those narratives. But Russia really managed to convince a considerable amount of segment of the Western population, and not only population, I would say the leadership as well, to make it look like this was some sort of response from the Russian side, and they were not the initiators, rather the responding side. And they were protecting the rights of the Russians living in currently Georgia's occupied territories. So this was something that was sold quite well, I would say, back then. And even up until 2022, I think there were a lot of illusions when it comes to why Russia started these wars. And there were certain justifications that would explain Russian rationale, I would say, behind these wars, and a blaming game as well. But 2022 was quite different because it was so clear, and especially during this age during digital age, when we can see what is happening on the ground almost momentarily. This also helped, as well as quite skillful strategic communications from the Ukraine side. And a lot of people like you, a lot of people who are now in Ukraine, who are able to communicate and to disseminate information, that has really helped to debunk these narratives and to show the world that this is not in any way a response. This is just an unprovoked invasion. And the ambitions of a leader who is convinced that he's able and he can take foreign territories. And the consequence of this 5-day war is occupation of 20% of the Georgian territories that are currently under occupation, and the effective control over these territories are exercised by Russians, of course. And we have a high presence of FSB troops on these territories, and they are still quite willing and quite good at using this as a pressure point whenever they need it. So this is an ongoing threat, and the active measures on these territories and outside of these territories as well, targeting Georgia is very much in action right now, despite the fact that some may argue that Russia is so invested these days in Ukraine, it doesn't have resources to target other countries. I certainly don't think that's the case, at least in case of Georgia, because in terms of non-military means, such as disinformation, cyber, economic pressure, Russia is still very present, still very active, and in some domains even more active than they used to be before.
Whoa. Hi, everybody. If you enjoyed this podcast and you'd like to help us out with our independent work, please subscribe to Kremlin File on Substack and on our YouTube channel. Kremlin File is hosted by Olga Lautman and me, Monique Kamara. Our production team is headed by Maddie Kaparov, and the theme music by Oreste Camarra. So please don't forget to visit our Kremlin File Substack for links to our socials and to wherever you'd like to listen to podcasts.